Good day, everyone. We're at the top of the hour and ready to begin our webinar today titled, Am I Sustainable? It's March 8th, 2016. I'm your host, Mike Lasecki, here at the Maricopa Community Colleges. We're excited to welcome participants and registrants from 38 different states and Puerto Rico for this event. So quite a huge interest across the country in this topic of sustainability. Let me briefly tell you about the system we're using. It's called Adobe Connect. Many of you have used the system before. Let me point out a few features. We will be asking you to respond to polls today. Actually, I'll reposition those polls so that they appear towards the center of your screen. All you have to do is click on the radial buttons. You can see the results live as they accumulate. Notice you can identify the participants. Every one of you can see all of the people that have logged in at this point. You might recognize colleagues. You can actually send them a message if you would like to in the participant window. The chat box is important because it's your mechanism for interacting with us. Besides the polls, we welcome your questions in the chat box. Remember, when you type in your question or your comment down there, you have to hit that little icon to the right, and that's the send button, so don't forget to do that. Okay, so let's test out that chat box right now. Would you please, right now, type your comments and questions and let me know the name of your organization and how many people are in the room with you today. Go ahead and use that chat box right now. Thank you. I see a number of people coming in. There was a question about sound. The broadcast test machines indicate that the audio level is fine outgoing, so thank you. Thanks everyone who's responding. You can see people just streaming in to the chat box. Thanks very much. So clearly we know how to use the chat box. Thank you, friends. I appreciate that. My pleasure to begin today's presentation with introductions. I'd like to introduce Rachel Bauer. She's from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and the principal investigator of ATE Central. Rachel, would you come on and say hello to everybody and then introduce your colleague?
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here today. Sustainability is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I run a research center at UW-Madison, and we are mostly grant funded, so we think about sustainability just like you all a lot of the time. And I'm thrilled to have Nancy Marin here. Nancy, can you just say a quick hello?
Hi, everybody.
Nancy's the founder of Blue Sky to Blueprint, which is a consulting group, and she's going to talk to you a little bit more about what they do, and she's going to be our primary speaker today. But before we get any farther into our presentation, we're going to test out that polling. So here's our first poll question. It lets us learn a little bit more about you. We have a mixed group here today. You can see we got lots of folks already coming in from the TAC community, lots of ATE folks. Give you another bit to respond. This is really interesting. We have quite a few folks who are coming in. A few people are saying other. If you're an other, could you type what your affiliation or how you would describe yourself into that chat box so we know a little bit about you? Maybe you're an administrator. It looks like a big chunk of our people today, not surprisingly, are affiliated with ATE, but some folks aren't. So, okay. Oh, there's somebody from TWOS. We have an administrator with us. That's great. Okay, so Mike, I think we can end that. So while most of you are probably familiar with this, and I don't want to talk too much about the ATE program, we just thought it might be helpful to remind all of you that ATE stands for Advanced Technological Education, and it is an NSF funding stream with a focus on technical education, a technician education rather, and lots of folks are working on things like curriculum development, professional development, and it is NSF's only real program that's so focused on community colleges. There are about 266 projects and centers nationwide that are currently funded, and it's an interesting group because while it is, well, a very important part of it for all of us is that it's a funding stream, it really is a true community. And there are a variety of cross-cutting supports in the community that are really there to help amplify and support the work that all of us are doing within ATE, including AT Central. That's part of what we do. But there are lots of other folks too. Some of you may be familiar with MentorLinks and Mentor Connect, or Evaluate, which is the large center that helps everybody in ATE with evaluation, and frankly, is a very good source for those of you who aren't even in ATE in terms of evaluation. They have a wonderful collection of materials. So just a little bit about AT Central so that you're aware of what we are if you aren't familiar. We act as a sort of information hub and portal for the community. We have a resource collection. We collect and catalog and archive all of the wonderful materials that are created within ATE. We also have created lots of services and tools, things like an events calendar, a newsletter. Do a lot of our focus is on outreach and dissemination. And we really try to be community driven. So in 2011, we did a community needs survey, got a lot of feedback from folks with projects and centers, and one of the biggest needs that they identified was more help around this topic of sustainability. And so when we put in our second grant, we worked with Nancy to develop this series of workshops and webinars. So obviously we're on a webinar today, but we also do workshops, which some of you may have participated in with us. And I just wanted to kind of let you know how the workshops and webinars came about, that it really was a need identified by ATE. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy now, who's going to really begin talking to you a little bit about her own background, and then jump into the meat of the webinar today, which is sustainability. So Nancy, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'll start by telling you just a little bit by way of background about the organization that came together with ATE. The place is called Ithaca. It's a not-for-profit organization that's been working at the intersection of education and technology for a very long time. The three items listed here are the three main elements and services of Ithaca. You may have heard of JSTOR. It's a collection of scholarly content, in particular journal articles and monographs. But the group I worked for about 8 years is Ithaca SNR, which is a strategy and research group. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've done for the past decade or so, which was with Ithaca, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm up to today. So over the course of the last really close to a decade, the group I was with focused on the question of sustainability. Now, at the time, we were being approached by all kinds of funders, NSF, NEH, JISC in the UK, and some Canadian funders as well. And the question they had was pretty much the same. We are making grants to these extremely important initiatives, and in our case, they tended to have a digital edge to them. We're building these collections, we're creating the software, but in every case, the project leaders keep coming back to us for another grant. Can't we find a way that these can be created almost as startups and be made self-sustaining? So I can hear the chuckling, even though everyone's muted. But the fact is that it's very, very hard to be self-sustaining, although that was the eye with which we started this work. So I'm showing these images on the screen because we actually developed a series of very detailed business strategy case studies, looking at places that were museums, academic institutions, libraries. So while they're not exactly the same thing as the ATE projects and centers, a lot of the struggles that the project leaders went through, you will find extremely familiar. And I recommend that you may want to have a look. Possibly more to the point was another paper that I got a chance to develop in the last couple of years. We did it first about 7 or 8 years ago, then I updated it about a year ago, which was really just to say, what are the business models that you can use? If you're working in the not-for-profit space, in the academic space, you have certain constraints, you have certain important mission goals, but there must be some business models that still fit, and specifically revenue generating models. So this is a report that you may also find useful, and some of the things we'll be talking about today come out of that report. today, actually, literally as of several months ago, I am now heading up a group called Blue Sky to Blueprint, doing very much what I was doing in the past, but broadening the scope. So not entirely looking at just digital initiatives, but still applying questions of business strategy to initiatives in the not-for-profit and academic sector. This is our website, just so you see. And well, today and for the next several months, Rachel and I are working together on a series of webinars. I have a separate workshop that takes people for a 3-day intensive session to really delve into these questions together. All of a sudden I apologize for interrupting the flow here, but all of a sudden I see the chat window at a very large size.
Yeah, it seems to have expanded. I'm not sure how that happened or why. Mike, can you give us...
Excuse me, just 1 second. I'll correct that. Thank you.
So Nancy, you're going to be doing the workshop in, where is that, in Chicago?
It's going to be at Northwestern University, so just outside of Chicago. And I'll flash this slide up again right at the end. But back to the matter at hand. Just to set the stage a bit for what we're going to cover today, this is really in guise of an introduction to what the key elements of sustainability are. You'll see that Rachel and I have planned a series of 4, and the 3 webinars that will follow are going to go into a bit more depth on 3 different elements. But the main goal for today is really to challenge what I think may be some assumptions about sustainability and what's possible and what's not, and to give you some personal brainstorming encouragement about thinking about the paths you might want to take and different routes you might want to explore. Actually, before we go to the poll, are there any questions?
And remember, if you have a question, just type it into into the chat box for us. Nancy, I do have one question that just popped up. Somebody asked, and maybe you're going to get to this in a bit, but somebody asked if most PIs find one model to sustain, or if they kind of cobble together a bunch of things as they think about sustainability.
Yeah, well, the main example, and this is kind of by the self-selecting group, and obviously this invited group, I'm going to take a wild guess that grant funding is going to be the primary source of financial support. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. What we have found, and one of the reasons that we're taking the approach of looking directly at funding questions this time, is that some of the project leaders, and particularly the center leaders, have found that there can be certain constraints when grant funding is your only source, and they want a little more flexibility. They might want to experiment a little more. They might want to make choices about how the money is used over that time. And finding additional sources that are not grant funded can give them that possibility. So there's nothing wrong with having multiple revenue streams that kind of work together in one model.
I think that's great. Hey, Mike, I noticed that with our polling box, I don't know if you can do something about this. Everybody's doing a great job of answering. It looks like there might be a button that we can't quite see so well. So there are 3 buttons that are viewable, and there's one sort of floating below it that's a little hard to see. I wonder if you can make that window any bigger. Maybe not. It looks like everybody, if you haven't already, folks, the poll question is up now. I think some of you were putting up. There we go. There we go. So if you didn't get a chance to add your vote into the actual poll, if you were putting it in the chat window, could you go ahead and add that? Just give it a second. It looks like almost everybody's done. Okay, so a high percentage of folks say that the time to start thinking about long-range plans, including sources of financial support, is either when the proposal is being developed, or a smaller percent think that maybe it's once the grant is funded. Okay, I think we can close that one. Thanks, Mike.
So, and I think that is terrific. That is really heartening to see. Although I would have to say my personal experience has been that there are in reality many, many more people who might check that very first box than I saw in today's poll, just because it's very natural to do that. Often everything seems so new and fresh. A project, the idea seems like a good idea, but first let's just make sure we get the grant. Now we have the grant, let's just make sure we execute it and do a great job. And oh my gosh, we have 18 months left. We have a year left. We've got to do that thing called a sustainability plan. So I'm very pleased to see, I think this group obviously is much more enlightened than that. But if you weren't, then you would also be in very good company. So the message here is that you can't really ever be too early. I mean, there's nothing that binds you to a plan. The idea is simply to start conceiving of what it could be. And the reason for that is because it may actually have an impact on choices you make about how to execute your project, the partnerships you might want to develop, and things like that along the way. So the message is you sketch it out as soon as you can, and you just know that you're likely to make changes. It's an ongoing process. Some of the methods that we're going to talk about today and in the webinars that will come are essentially research. It's probably a lot of things that you're doing as part of your evaluation process, and this should all feed right back into a sustainability plan. The new intelligence you gather should help you make choices, not just about how to execute the proposal you wrote several years ago, but how to make tweaks along the way to make it even better, because things change.
Nancy, I think you've said to me before that it's the quote early and often. Yeah. Early and often, yeah. Is it? Okay, so we have another poll right away, and basically this is just asking you a little bit about how you're thinking about the work of your project or center. If you'd like to continue it, even after your funding, and you could just kind of keep doing it forever. You'd like to grow, develop, and change as you need to over time, or you're kind of ready to move on. Maybe it's a 2 or 3 year grant. You have a very specific goal, but it's not something you want to necessarily refund or sustain into the long haul. So keep going here, folks. For anyone, we're getting a lot of answers. Most people seem to be falling into that grow, develop, and change as needs change over time category. Interestingly, we have nobody who says they could do this forever. All right, I think we've hit our max, and I think we can close that.
Yeah, and and again, of course, this is music to my ears. These are the answers there make perfect sense to me. I think it might be, everything changes, right? The project you worked on is probably still a great project. The people you built it for may have a different set of needs. You might decide that you have a different type of audience or a different focus that can shift even within the scope of the project that was already planned. I will say that, though, again, it was not even a little bit surprising, or it wouldn't be surprising. People would never confess to this, but there are lots of people who start projects and really just want to keep doing what they were doing. And there's no shame in that at all. It's not necessarily a good strategy given how rapidly everything else changes. The last one, we have a couple of people mention that wrapping up successfully is great. I'm on to the next thing. And I'd have to say that's another perfectly reasonable response, particularly on some of the smaller projects that are more limited in scope. We were going to try this. It was a pilot. It went quite well. I'm on to the next thing. That was done. So what we'll talk about is, there might be ways that sustainability just looks very different if that's what your plan is. So the question really is a question that you ask yourself. What is it that you actually do want to sustain? This could take different forms. Is it a couple of key outputs? It could be, for example, curriculum that you wrote. It could be a textbook that your program put together. Is there a new program or service that you're interested in doing or that you'd like to keep running? Or actually, in some cases, people built a team and put a very successful team together and want to keep that team going, whatever the next project is that they cook up. So in a first instance, we encourage people to think pretty hard about how they're defining sustainability. What do they really want out of this process? They want to keep everything exactly the way it is? Probably not. Are there elements of it that in order to continue to deliver the great value you've created, you're going to need to keep going? Is there a technological aspect? Is it your staffing has to stay in place in a more stable way? Have you developed partnerships that you're going to have to keep nurturing? Certainly in terms of content, there could be all kinds of curriculum or actually texts or materials that have been developed. If they're sitting on a website, you may have to think of something a little bit more long term. And there are other things like the impact, whether it's through faculty or through students. So figuring out what there is that you're going to need to keep doing and how you're going to need to protect it is the first step.
Nancy, this is a perfect time because somebody just asked a question about whether it was possible to measure sustainability.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We, a few years ago, some colleagues and I attempted to have like, I don't know what we called it. It was going to be like, can you grade it? Can you say, you're doing great, you're not doing great? That gets so subjective. I think we abandoned the plan immediately. So I can tell you just what some markers seem to be. For example, and the other observation was that when we were looking at this, the projects we were looking at were often in the humanities. They were often content based, and it was hard to say something had died. Someone once said, "Can you find me what's a failure story? Did it die? Did it disappear?" And it's kind of hard to find a lot of examples of things that entirely disappear. So you could point to something and say, well, it's still being sustained. It's someplace. It's findable. And so that encouraged us to set the bar a bit higher. So, it's not necessarily a thumbs up or thumbs down, sustainable or entirely unsustainable, but we'd like to encourage people to set a pretty high bar so that we're not talking about like a sustenance level. We're talking about something that's a really strong and thriving cycle of ongoing support. So in that sense, how can you measure that? You can measure it. The easiest way, does have to do with continuing to produce the things that you're producing that are valuable. So again, that can be internships, it can be number of students through a program, whatever the metrics are you use now. If those are trending upward, that's a very good sign. There are other things too, just the amount of attention, the enthusiasm of your partners and their willingness to continue to donate and participate. If those things are still very strong and that cycle is there, people giving you things, whether it's their time or money, and you converting that into more great works, that's a very good sign. If something is simply findable because we haven't lost it yet, we would say that is not the bar. That is not a high enough bar to set. So what does this look like? If you want to sustain something that's just the output, there actually is an entire large literature about preservation, for example. You might have written a textbook, so you might need to deposit it somewhere. It could be an institutional repository. It could be on the website at your university or college, but there could be an answer for that. If you want, for example, to sustain a new program or even your entire team working on it, then you're going to need to think about other things like you may need future funding, almost certainly you will, and you may need to even look beyond grant funding to other sources of support. Mike?
Nancy, we seem to have
I don't see.
lost control there.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I
Why don't you take us back? Why don't you go ahead, Nancy, and take us back to where we were?
So, I mean, I don't see that. I'll stop advancing the slides, Mike, if you guys want to play around with the slide deck.
Okay. So where would
And
you
would
like
you
to
like
go
me
now?
to just, um, well,
It seems to be working for me. Nancy, is that where you were?
you know what? On this slide, I just see blue.
It's
So
looking
actually,
good
Rachel,
here. Yes.
how about Rachel, if one of you guys can just advance the slides for me, I can speak
I
to
can
them and
I can
know what's on
absolutely.
them.
So we're on first. What do you want to sustain? Would you like me to go to the
Okay.
next one, Nancy?
Yeah, go to the next one.
Okay, so it says,
So,
are you sustainable?
okay, so are you sustainable? Yes, it's very surprising to see a blue canvas in front of me with no words on it. But so are you sustainable? And following from the last question, it really depends. That the mark of what you want to reach depends on what your goals are about sustainability. If you want to preserve an object, that's one thing. And there's some guidelines on how to deposit it, how to make sure your metadata is good, how to make sure it's discoverable. But really today what we're thinking about is if you have longer range plans for what the impact is you want to deliver, then I'm going to suggest that whether or not you are sustainable is going to boil down to one critical question. Rachel, next slide.
Got it.
Who cares, right? um, and I don't really mean this flippantly, although I'm aware that it sounds quite harsh. Rather, I'm going to suggest that this idea might help us to get to the heart of a pretty important matter, which is what is so important, and can you identify what is so very important about what it is you do? So specifically, we'll start with people. Who are the people who benefit the most from your work? Rachel, next slide.
Got it.
So we'll talk a little bit about your audience. You might actually think of them as an audience. For you, you're going to think about them maybe as students, as professors, industry partners, can be your institution for a stakeholder, for example. There's two ways to think about this, and it's worth kind of teasing them apart. There are those who benefit directly, for example, students who enroll in a course, and then there are those who benefit indirectly, and that might be that they don't engage directly with the work you do, but they're going to see a lot of benefit from what it is you do all the same. And that would be like your host institution. Your college, for example, is surely reaping benefits of prestige, not to mention, I imagine, some overhead, thanks to all the good work you do. So those are really significant stakeholders, but they operate in different ways. So if you're thinking about it in almost market research terms, those are two different segments that you have to think about, what they get from it and how you can express that to them. So, who are they? How does your work improve their lives or further their mission? And then, and this is the toughest one really, do they consider what you do a nice to have? Or do they consider it a must have? So let's, Rachel, I think the next slide should be a poll.
It is. So here we have another poll, and this is focusing on that issue of understanding our audience. So we want to understand. We want to know a little bit more about how you look to understand your audience, and people are answering here. That's how we at AT Central ended up doing the sustainability work, because we talked to everybody in ATE and we did a survey and got lots of good feedback around the issue of sustainability.
So this is great. So conducting surveys, frequently speaking with members of your target audience to get informal feedback. It seems like almost everybody. And then only 2 people are confessing to it, but I know we all take guesses.
Absolutely. And whoever put an other in, if you feel like it, pop that into the chat window. We're curious to see what your other is also.
One of the nice things, we did a bit of work with folks in libraries, and we encouraged them to go, and as a bit of homework, we helped them to draft a couple of key things they wish they knew more about. And they went from behind their desks, for example, down into the reading rooms and to the stacks, and just started talking with people. And that level of direct but somewhat informal feedback was just so tremendously valuable in terms of hearing what the actual issues are people confront. So it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of this, which is wonderful.
All right. Well, I think we've got that that covered, and somebody put in the chat, I think the person who put other said multiple approaches include surveys, interviews that reference informal feedback, lots of timely checkpoints, and interestingly, social media, which is a great way to certainly understand your audience. Something we should have had up here is sort of social media feedback.
Yeah, I think that's terrific. I mean, so, and there's also, it really, in a way, it depends on what it is you feel you need to know, right? So we could probably do an entire session just on let's figure out what we think we know versus what we are sure we know, and come up with what the best way is to fill in those gaps. So often, for example, people know a ton about the numbers. They know how many people show up for something. They know how many people may get from point A to point B. In your case, since you're often dealing with people in real time, in real space, and not just an online situation, you probably know demographically quite a lot as well. The piece, and maybe I'll just throw this out here, this is so tough to have a question because I know we just have a chat box, but the piece that I found folks have the hardest time nailing down has to do with the attitudes. What brings someone to you? What about what you're doing is the most important to them? Is it transformational in the way you imagine it is, or you'd like it to be? On the attitude stuff, those conversations are quite important. So,
it's important to kind of note here that the third of our series of webinars is actually on knowing your audience. So we have a whole webinar on April 19th, and we'll show you a list at the end titled Know Your Audience, the Rest Will Follow, a deeper dive into audience assessment. So that's something that you guys have identified as something you want to work on more, and we're responding with a webinar that's specifically focused on audience.
So I'm not sure what slide we're on, Rachel, but slide 23. Yeah, so it sounds like folks here are doing quite a bit of this work already, which is great. So the question to ponder really is, and this again I know sounds kind of harsh, but there's your audience. Here are your users, or your audience, or your stakeholders. What would they do if you disappeared? How badly would they take this? Who are the people or the groups of people who would rally to your defense, for example, if you should learn tomorrow that you had no more funding? I'll give you an example. I work with some public libraries, and this is actually something that literally can take place from one day to the next, and actually federal funding programs too. But let's say there's a moment of drama, there's a crisis, the funding is pulled, everyone rallies, they make a big play for something, and that can happen, and that can be very clarifying. But even without waiting for such a dramatic moment to present itself, I just suggest that this is a useful way and a useful lens through which to think about and to look at the things that are the most valuable about what you do. What is it that you do that is so valuable that literally people cannot and will not do without it? So would they fight to keep you? Would they fight for some parts of what you're doing but not other parts? Which people would insist on keeping which elements? And if you actually feel or you find that they wouldn't, how can you make sure that your work is inspiring this kind of devotion? So just that's a bit of food for thought, again, to go into a little bit more when we do the audience webinar. But, one of the questions can be, if they're not fighting for you or they're not feeling like they would, could there be other alternatives out there? And is that something we need to think about? So next slide. What else might be out there that serves a similar purpose to what it is that you do? We're going to talk a little bit in our fourth webinar about the competitive environment and the funding environment. How special is what you do? How unique is what you do? And that's actually a tricky question also, because if we ask ourselves this, we will say what we do is unique in all the world. Of course it is. We are all, very, very special, and nothing can compare. But the real question is, how do the beneficiaries see that, and how do they think you compare? And So another example just from popular culture these days has to do with uh, scholarly works, people talking about peer-reviewed, serious sources of scholarship compared to, I don't know, a Wikipedia entry. We can all sit here, where most of us working in universities, and we understand that one is better than the other. But if you ask certain groups of people what they use, they will, may mumble it under their breath, but they will tell you they go to Wikipedia first because it's good enough. So it's extremely important to know, not just in some kind of generic objective way, if something ranks higher than someone else, but you need to also know what your folks are going to and what they're using if they're not engaging with your service or your offering. So let's push this idea a little further. So next slide. What actually is valuable enough that people will advocate for it? What is so valuable that people will pay for it? And further, what is so valuable that people are going to donate not just money, but their time and their effort to really dig in and make it a success? Are there any questions at this point? I feel like I've been talking a bit, maybe some chats.
There is a question. Somebody just chatted to me that they were wondering if there are studies or research that they can kind of refer to as they start to think about sustainability.
Yeah, there definitely are. I don't think I included a reading list in this slide deck, but afterwards, Rachel and I can definitely post one when we post the recording of this webinar.
And there is a long list of resources on AT Central under the Sustainability tab, and a lot of those came from prior webinars and workshops. So we will add to that if we think it needs to be updated, but if folks are interested, they can go to AT Central on the Sustainability page, and that link is towards the end of the slide deck, so you'll be able to click through it when Janet sends out to all of you the link. And you'll be able to get to those resources. And then, of course, there's a lot of good stuff at Ithaca also, right, Nancy, that people can look at too.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of those case studies are on the Ithaca website, and some are on my website. The point is that what's interesting about that approach is that there's no obvious answer. There's no cookie cutter answer. When you look at how very successful projects have come up with plans that work, they tend to bump into a couple of walls, back up, try again, tinker with this, tinker with that. And what we tried to do in those case studies is to figure out what the key decision-making points were. At what point did a project leader say, this just isn't working, I have to retool? And so we try to capture that. And I think hearing from others about both the tactics they used, but more importantly, when they had the courage to say, this isn't the right direction, I need to shift direction, is quite important. The one example that I use all the time, just because it just is such a clear and obvious good exemplar for how this works, was a clever project, an NSF-funded project called eBird out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And if any of folks have been on these webinars before, you might get bored of hearing me mention it, but I adore this project because it's, first of all, very clever. It's an online program that allows people to enter observations of watching birds. And it was originally started by a bunch of academic, ornithologists who felt they wanted to gather more birding observations to do their research. Well, providing observations for scientists to do their research didn't really set the birding world on fire. Birders just want to go out and watch birds. Whether or not they enter it into someone else's database was really far down their list of interests. Until the folks at eBird realized this. And they said to themselves, you know what, we've got to make something that is going to be more like candy for the birders. We want the birders. We want them to do this because it's fun for them. And they shifted their focus and they changed a few things about the interface. They made it something that birders would love because it allowed them to keep checklists. And all of a sudden, what was a kind of a quiet project really, really boomed. And you see a lot in the citizen science world, whether it's Cornell with eBird or whether it's the folks at Galaxy Zoo. But this is because of a really, really sharp focus on how people were going to engage with it and what the value would be to the users. So I'd also say that when you think about a reading list, if you go looking for sustainability, you're easily going to wander into a lot of things that talk about the environment. The truth is, and I don't mind sharing this at all, a lot of the really interesting literature that applies to the questions that we're talking about here comes right out of the for-profit world as well. Many of the same thoughts about what makes an enterprise run successfully are extremely useful for thinking even about not-for-profits and academics. You just simply subtract, profitability as the goal and replace it with a mission, and some of the things change, but a fundamental focus on end users and delivering value is quite transferable. Anyway, onward. So Rachel, what slide do we have up? Are we talking about the value slide?
Yeah, we've got translating value to funding model is the slide I just advanced to.
Terrific. So that's great. So what I would say is that in other presentations, we've often focused a lot on kind of the meat and potatoes, or even like the green vegetables that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to really focus on your audience and think hard about the environment. And we even have some sessions that cover forecasting and budgeting. And I'm not doing budgeting this time, but we're pretty much going to do everything else in the next few weeks. Sometimes we stop short of talking about funding, actually raising funding, because there's frequently been a little bit of pushback about, do I need to? I'm with a funding agency that's been extremely generous, sometimes over many years. This seems like all I may need to do for the time being, and this group is extremely successful at developing grants and coming up with ideas for new grants. But this time we're going to actually talk about how to translate these ideas of value into potential things that could lead to new sources of revenue. And we'll do it as a brainstorm, a collective, webinar-enabled brainstorm to see what comes up. But first, we have, I believe, our next poll.
Yeah, we do. So we are down to the last sort of 15 minutes of our presentation. I think is this our final poll, Nancy? I can't remember. I think it might be.
I think
maybe one more
for this.
When I start to think about revenue generating activities, and turn quickly back to drafting the next grant proposal. Don't waste any time thinking about it. It would never work for us. Think there could be something worth exploring there, but maybe you haven't kind of gotten to the point of figuring out how to do that. Let's see. So lots of folks are in that last category. A few are being very honest, and myself included. I tend to jump to that first one. Just a few more seconds here. All right, I think everybody who's answered is probably going to. It looks like most people fall into that last category of thinking that there could be something worth exploring. A few people feel that it wouldn't work for them, a couple people, and then about 18% are saying they're basically thinking about grant writing.
Yeah, well, and look, and again, like I'm a big fan of grant writing. There's nothing wrong with that. I think, this is really a chance to explore something new. And I would be the first one to say, as much as I love the brainstorm, let's think about what we can do. Let's take a look at all the great work you've done and figure out if there isn't some way we can leverage this to find an additional revenue source. The next piece of hard work, today we're just going to cause trouble and raise all kinds of interesting ideas. But the next piece of hard work is figuring out how to evaluate that. And how to say, you know what, that sounded interesting, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to work. Or this one sounds interesting, but there's a couple of questions that I still have. How can I go answer those questions? But for today, we're just going to start. We're going to open up the question with the brainstorm, and then we'll see how far we get down the path of identifying new ideas.
Oh, there we go. Great, that's closed. Okay, I just moved you on to the value assessment framework, Nancy.
Okay, terrific. So, and this is just also a reminder that we are definitely not talking about like we're just out to make money, whatever it is. You're never going to hear me suggest like, starting a clothing line on the side if your mission is training future biotechnicians. The logic here is thinking about taking a look at the full picture of what you already do, what your mission is, what your accomplishments have been, and then taking that as a starting point to determine where there might be other future sources of support. So I came up, and I do say sources of support, so not necessarily all entirely just financial. So this value assessment framework was something that we came up with a while ago, and it's actually, if you look at that that report with the purple cover on business models or revenue models, this is discussed in some detail there, and actually each of these options is discussed in some detail. But what I like about it for this group is just zeroing in on what sources of value might be. So what I'll do right now, I won't bore you too much with this, but I'm going to walk through just what some of those big buckets of ideas are. And maybe, Rachel, I'll ask if you have some other thoughts of how this could translate in some specific ways. So for example, let's say you've created something that is content related. In this space, what that might be, that could be course materials. It could actually be textbooks. It could be curriculum or curriculum guides. What other kinds of content might there be that you've been developing as a result of your work?
People are welcome to put that in the chat box if they'd like, but maybe videos. What else? Any other workshops?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not seeing anything else in the chat window. Well, let me see. Oops.
Yeah.
Here we go. Oh, it says, someone has asked the question, can you address the importance of gaining the support of your institution? Someone else has asked, I don't think you can license material developed with federal funding. Can you? And then someone else actually just put in annual student competitions. So that's another good thing that is content. The issue of licensed materials developed with federal grant funding, you can actually do that. I know that's come up before, and I know Celeste has addressed it. And it's an issue of how you license it.
So, and I can, a couple of things. One is that we will have Celeste on it sounds like we'll have Celeste on a future webinar, so we can actually keep ourselves a list of things to send her way. But more to the point, for today, I wanted to point out in that far right column, it says, is this method compatible with open access? And I think that starts to get out at, maybe in an oblique way, what that question was asking, which is, we're the recipient of federal funds. Some of these things have to be off the table, right? They're going to tell me that they funded it to make it as widely available and freely available as possible. And that almost always is the case. It depends, I guess, grant to grant. But there are very few of the things on this list that would absolutely fly in the face of that kind of a mandate. So for example, if you created content and only shared it in exchange for someone paying for it, that might be different from what the original terms of the plan were. Same thing with the subscription model. If you were to kind of shut down a part of what you did and only make it available if someone paid, I could see that possibly being against the terms of the project. But there are so many different flavors of how this actually works that you certainly might be able to come up with a good solution. Now, I see, and I see Deirdre Sullivan, who is the PI of the MATE project, has mentioned with something like a textbook, the grant funding may be what's helping you to write it. But Deirdre, if you don't mind my quoting you from this chat window, but you would go broke giving them away for free. So there are some kind of outputs that it may be understood that the funding will help to get started or will help subsidize. So in addition to selling things, that licensing question, someone mentioned Creative Commons as an option for ways people share it. But I'd also suggest that there might be ways that you are making something freely available to your audience as you promised, But you have also created something almost in a business-to-business kind of way that might be very valuable to other institutions to take on. So I wonder if folks have thoughts on that. If anyone has a personal example of we created something and actually we've licensed the content we created for others to use. I'm seeing some typing. We'll wait a second to see if that comes in. And then Mike, you had a point that you were making, I think, about freemium. I wonder if you'd like to share that example with us.
See, we originally developed a series of modules, curriculum modules, which we tried a variety of license. For example, you could buy the whole suite of modules, you could buy them individually, and we had some success with that. But we found over time that faculty, and most of us would sort of nod their heads about this, are more used to getting things for free than paying for them. So we saw a decline in our, let's call them module sales. And then we started making them free, sort of bundling them as an advantage of being part of our network, of connecting with us. And then we turned that even further into using that into our next grant that we submitted. We would say that we would create this broad dissemination network that includes access to our module library and things like that. So it became a selling point to work with us as opposed to a selling of the modules themselves. We ended up gaining much more going towards that freemium model.
Yeah, that sounds great. And that's actually, I could imagine something that looks more like partnership or membership model where this is one of the benefits. Could also be another way to leverage the value of that content. So that's a terrific example. So if we go, so those are a certain number of ideas, and this is, again, we're going to get into this particular topic in a lot more detail in our next webinar, which is April 5th. But this is just a quick overview of how this value assessment kind of brainstorm would work. Another area are tools and services. So let's say, for example, you've developed a way of doing something or a certain kind of software that facilitates someone's life or workflow. Could you license that? Is that something that you're making freely available in one place but might have other applications elsewhere? You've certainly been working with your team for a long time to actually come up with whatever the project is. Have you developed a certain expertise that's really quite exceptional? I hear more and more of folks who started something that could have been grant funded, somewhat experimental, and then all of a sudden they're the expert. And so what they're doing is then being able to, everyone's very collegial, so I'm sure everyone is sharing information as well, but in some cases actual consulting time and services are needed, and that's a fee service. I wrote down publishing platform, but it doesn't have to be publishing. In the case of, of actual publishers, we noticed that there was a shift from I developed a platform in a way to put my content online to let's see if others would pay me for the benefit of putting their content online. And so that's another type of example.
Should I go ahead and move through to the next slide, Nancy, as we're getting close to the end of our...
Oh, sure. There was a question about, well, anyway, so I'm not sure if I understand some of the questions in the chat. And I would say if there are any follow-up questions that we don't answer, I'd be very happy to follow up with you later. But we'll be working through some of the ideas in this. I'd like to just for people to think of this as literally a framework, a way to make sure that you shake the bushes everywhere you can to come up with good ideas for yourselves. So moving on, Rachel, I think we do have a last poll question.
We do. Of the following options, the one we are most likely to consider would be, Mike, can you make that just a teeny bit bigger? It looks like we might have cut off. Well, maybe not. I can't quite tell. But we have content sales or licensing, technology sales or licensing, corporate sponsorships, membership or similar participation model. I'm not sure if we're missing... Okay, we have an other, and if you want to pop that other into the chat window. Somebody asked if the chat would be posted, and I believe, Mike or Janet, you can answer this. I think that when folks are viewing the webinar, they can see that chat, correct? So they can see if there are things that they'd like to record from the chat. They have the ability to see all of that.
That's correct, Rachel.
Is that? Yeah. Okay, so you'll be able to sort of, if you look through this again online, you'll be able to see everything. And it looks like at this point, we have sort of a tie between corporate sponsorships and membership or participation models are sort of the two highest at the moment in terms of the options folks are likely to consider.
Yeah, that is terrific. And this is very interesting to see. And I'm really hoping that folks who have voiced an interest here and are on the board will join us on April 5th. Deirdre will be with us, actually able to speak, not just type quickly.
And she has a lot of good stuff to share, I think, yeah.
She has wonderful things to share, as do many of particularly the ATE, the folks who are running the centers have so many different moving parts. I would love to hear from anyone who, I haven't called out in the past who has other great examples to share, because kind of being able to pick apart your decision-making process and how you got where you got and how you've, dealt with challenges is super valuable to the rest of the community.
Gordon just mentioned contract training as an other too, I think.
That's great. And I wonder if that's, in terms of a model, if you're talking about that's something that you do as a service, almost like, a fee for service for that kind of training.
Yeah, I think that sounds like what he's talking about.
Yeah.
All right, so should we close this poll and move along to the next slide?
Sure.
Mike, can you close that? There we go. And the next slide, Nancy, has a whole bunch of bullets. I'm going to put all the bullets up at once, if that's okay, because they walk through.
Do you want me to just I'm going to walk through them. Could you just click as I read them?
Okay, fabulous.
Okay, I'll go quick. I see we're at the time. So the first step is you have to define those long-range goals for your project. What do you really, really want to sustain, and what needs to be sustained to reach those goals? Next slide. The next step is to really carefully assess all the elements that you're going to need to continue to deliver value. So that was the brainstorm where we said, do I really need all these people? Do I need to keep up my technology, et cetera, et cetera? The next step, which we didn't talk about today, but maybe some future day, is how to develop a budget. Not just what you're spending down in the grant, but if you're going to continue a piece of this, how would you budget that out just for the element you want to continue? What's the most important? Next is to assess the value that you're delivering to your direct and indirect beneficiaries. And here we're going to start to see, you want to put down some ideas now, but you're going to assume, or you're going to figure that a lot of these are assumptions that you're going to have to test. Next is to assess the role that your project or center is playing in the wider landscape. So again, today we may think we're the center of the universe, but we're going to push you in a future webinar to really go out there and double check those assumptions. And finally, we want you to use some of these tools, particularly this value assessment tool, to really brainstorm and think about what all the possible sources of support are. Some of it might be revenue generating through services or content or something like that. Someone wrote in, don't forget to talk about host support, and that's on the list too, under contributions to mission, for example. These are really, really important things to do, and it's worth not leaving any stone unturned. So Rachel, I think we can skip over the next slide.
Sure.
Which is just an outline of a process we'll talk about on another day. To remind you yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to pop up one final time a list of the webinars. This is the slide that we're on now, and it just points to, you can go to atecentral.net/sustainability. We list all the future webinars, give you a little outline of what's involved, any special guests. Mike is going to be on the webinar in May. We'll have a special guest on the 19th that has yet to be determined, and then we have Deirdre and Celeste are both on the next webinar on April 5th. So you can go and sign up there. We'd love to have you involved. And then I'm going to flip to the next one, which just again reminds you that Nancy has this wonderful business model boot camp coming up in August, and you can go to bluesky2blueprint.com for that. So we really want you to quickly just take a little survey here for us. Mike, can you go ahead and open that survey? I know we're right at the end of our hour.
Yes, I will. And Rachel, I want to remind you and Nancy not to open the survey, but rather just to leave it alone. Folks, as the survey comes up, it depends on your particular system. It may launch automatically, or you might have to click on the name of the survey and the Browse To link. Our test machine showing the surveys popping up now, Rachel, so you can go ahead.
Yep. It is. So while you guys are taking the survey, are there any, I don't know if I can see here in the chat window, there we go. Um, if there are any other questions that in the last couple minutes here, I know people may have to jump off, but if there are questions for Nancy.
Came in via email. Could I bring that one forward, Rachel, as we wrap up here?
I'm sorry?
One question did come in from email.
Yeah, sure.
Can I bring that one forward?
Absolutely,
So,
Mike.
The question said that Nancy sort of alluded to creating a network, and many people today are interested in these communities of practice. And it seems to the person writing in that a community of practice could be really something that acts as the primary sustaining vehicle for a project or an initiative. Nancy, how would you respond to that? Does that make sense?
Well, I feel like that's part of a very interesting conversation. I mean, community of practice is one of these great phrases, and I may not know all the colors that are involved in that. But my question is always, what is it that really binds that community into a community? You see a lot of kind of startup initiatives. Let's try this, and a bunch of people, they'll meet once or twice and they'll do something, and then they get distracted and move on to something else. The question is what you need from it in order to be sustained. So, and that will tell you how much you have to turn a community into practice into a membership group. So I guess my question would be, the more we know about what your actual needs are and how robust this community of practice is, then the answer could be yes, but you'd have to know a bit more about what it is you actually would require of them in order to be sustainable.
That makes sense. Well, thank you for that, Rachel. We're perfectly on time. We're just at the top of the hour. You and Nancy, I just love the way you worked back and forth across the webinar. It was very effective, and a lot of participation in the polls and the chat window today. I think that just shows this broad interest in this topic of sustainability today. Rachel, any closing comments as we wrap up for today?
Thank you so much, Mike. This was a great webinar, and a couple people just put in the chat window that they thought it was an hour and a half. I'm sorry if there was some confusion over that. We try to keep them to an hour. We always feel like people are so busy that it's hard to do 90 minutes. But I apologize to those folks who did set aside an hour and a half to join us. We'll be absolutely sure to make it clear in the next one what the time is. But thank you for joining us, everybody. Nancy and I look forward to seeing you on the next webinar and to having you join us for the whole series. And yes, the PowerPoint slides will be available. Those will be sent out afterwards. Somebody just asked that too.
Good. Well, thank you again, Nancy and Rachel. This officially concludes our webinar, so I'll go ahead and leave the survey up for another couple of minutes, but we're going to shut down our audio broadcast as of now. So thank you both again. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.